You are very welcome to this question and answer session about things indirectly nuclear. So let's get on with it. And most of the questions are from underneath yesterday's video on the main channel. I wonder if there's a difference between Putin, the political monolith, asks, does Aggropop? And Putin, the father and grandfather. He might want to sacrifice the world to his ideals, but he wouldn't want to sacrifice his children and grandchildren. It's really important to understand how the family will take relatively little priority in the mind of somebody like Putin when it comes to making world historical decisions as he perceives them. That's different with politicians in the West. Their kid gets sick, they can say, to hell with this political career. Completely possible. But in the Soviet system, it was so exceptional to see Gorbachev, who loved Raisa, his partner, so desperately that relationship did actually take priority over everything else in his world. That was very beautiful. And I had a section on that in the Gorbachev video in the main channel, which I took out because I thought it was a bit off topic. But there's a little bit in my head that tells me to make a brief video, maybe on chat, about the magic of their relationship. This is very different with Putin. We should expect that in that kind of political culture. We should expect that from the kind of political leader Putin is. How do you get inside the head of somebody for whom their family will not be a central part of their decision-making process? Well, it's always best to begin starting with your situation and little by little taking things away. I mean, imagine a friend of yours is third in their organization and they have 12 staff, but there's a couple of people in the organization who they're accountable to. And then imagine they get the CEO job and it's a small organization and there's 174 staff. And suddenly they're responsible for 174 people, and before it was 12. And that's just about that kind of ballpark where power in a tiny, tiny way begins to feel tangible. And there's a kind of a woo, like this. Oh, this is not that, this is different. And then 500 staff? Wow, okay, this is a different texture. And you can see how people with the wrong personality immediately could get lost on this and drunk on it. So multiply that by 1,000 and you're going to be approximating Putin. So no, in the scheme of the big decisions he makes, he's going to allow his political, historical, quasi-spiritual narratives to take precedence over everything, including family. Ian asks, is the reverse true? Does Putin consider our values and our likely course of action just as wisely as you should suggest we consider his? No. One of the things that has made me nervous, I would say ever since the return of Putin after Medvedev, is how low our capacity has been to understand what the Russians who are running Russia, are thinking and feeling. Right? It's not about accommodating that, but it's about grasping it as it is, not as we would wish it to be. And so we have taken them to be a lot more pragmatic than they are, for example, and a lot more sort of, coldly calculating. And suddenly all of this mystical stuff comes our way and we're thrown. And that's been particularly frustrating because in Western culture, we have had relevantly placed experts who understood all of this. But as ever, we've got, tragedies all over the place happening around the compartmentalization of knowledge in our society. But as worried as I am about that, us not getting the Putin regime, although we're getting better at it now over many, many years, it's way worse the other way. So if we are terribly wrong about them, they are way less competent than we are, And the isolation of Putin is particularly dangerous here, because with us, we have got entire infrastructures, entire teams, entire systems propping up our political elites' understanding of what is going on in Russia, and at least that has a bit of robustness to it, and to a large extent that's absent there. And the sort of individuals you're going to find at the top of the Putin regime are very unlikely to be good at even understanding how we think well, let alone understanding exactly what we think at a particular moment on a particular issue. So that's very disturbing. And in fact, that kind of, if you like, interpretive cross purposes is indeed an existential threat. We lost our battery, but we are back. Can you comment on Pavel Podvig's response to Masha Gessen's piece in the New Yorker that you mentioned in the video? It's a bit tricky for our community because most people wouldn't know who Pavel Podvig is, and most people wouldn't have read Masha Gessen's piece. I think Masha's piece is in some ways more alarmist than my video, and it was, I think, very widely read. It comes up really fast on Google if you put in the words nuclear and Putin at the moment. And it's titled Why Putin Would Use Nuclear Weapons, not will, would use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And I do think that Masha's piece is more alarmist than my video. It's, of course, much longer and much more eloquent essayistically and journalistically, but my piece is more eloquent philosophically. And Pavel Podvig was very critical of Masha's piece. And Pavel Podvig is a nuclear weapons expert, is a Russian, an expert on Russian nuclear weapons. And he is marvelous as a walking illustration of how to be a responsible communicator with expertise. He will never intentionally transgress out of his lane. He's enormously responsible in the way he says, I know about this, I don't know about that, and as I don't know about that, I'm going to shut up. So he is, even though I'm going to be critical of him, I think in a moment, we can say that he is a sort of a marvelous manifestation of how to not just inspire trust in a particular expert, but how to inspire trust in expertise in general. And Pavel retweeted Masha's tweet about her New Yorker essay, and he said, "This is wrong on so many levels. I don't know why people almost cheer for Putin to use nuclear weapons just to prove that he is the evil criminal they believe he is. Then they think that using nuclear weapons is a deus ex machina." Which is an expression with a history, but we can roughly say that it means an unexpected action or event that brings a solution to a situation that seemed insoluble. And then they think that using nuclear weapons is a deus ex machina. And then he says, this is a very bold statement that does a lot of heavy lifting in the piece. Quote, Masha is saying here, Putin is not afraid of losing the support of his current allies. And Pavel here asks, is there any evidence for it? Haven't seen any. And I would say there's quite a bit of evidence to the contrary. So this was one of the lines in Masha's piece that I was myself quite a lot more conservative about, because I do seem to be struck by the, at least, impression that China is an effective, up to a point at least, up to some kind of a meaningful point, an effective block on Putin using nuclear weapons. And then Pavel says, in the end, the logic of pieces like this completely escapes me. Putin believes he will survive the nuclear disaster, Masha says, quote unquote, but, quote, he may fear an extreme conventional response from NATO. That was a quote from Masha, and Pavel says, really? I would say that this kind of muddled thinking is outright dangerous. Please don't. Okay. Pavel is wrong. He's constitutively wrong. So my video, but he's also, of course, right about several of the things he says here. But what is fundamentally wrong about is that Masha, without using any philosophical conceptual apparatus, basically tries to say that we've got to realize that while he isn't irrational, Putin doesn't meet some conventional definitions of rationality in a nuclear actor that we operate with in the West. Masha doesn't say we need to consider Putin's values like I argue in the video. Masha doesn't say exactly what it means to consider them and not to consider them and what the consequence of not doing so is. But she is actually in a much more interesting and eloquent and perhaps alarmist way exploring that territory. And Pavel Podvig is speaking of duty if he wants to comment on the issues of whether Putin's values matter to how he's going to think about a strategic nuclear exchange. That is not Pavel's lane, except at dinner in private or on Twitter, but commenting as a very informed, intelligent citizen, not commenting as an expert. So as a philosopher, I'm comfortable to come in here and say that there is an incompleteness here in the way Pavel is operating, because he is fundamentally telling somebody not to have a conversation about an issue which he is not professionally qualified to judge himself. So the problem here is, even if Masha's piece is not good in most of its claims and assertions, even if Masha is a quarter right, it's not Pavel's professional expertise to assess this. Sorry. So this is a transgression of, the distinction of when one is on duty and when one is off duty. And Pavel is clearly speaking on an issue on which he can only speak off duty. And therefore he cannot professionally judge whether Masha is wrong or right. So that's, even though I'm very sympathetic to several other things he says in this 3-point thread on Twitter, that's my fundamental conclusion. Mike Page asks, when Putin says there's no point in the world existing, to whom is he talking? He's talking to the West. But the point is, how far is this kind of idea internalized? And how far is the idea internalized by Putin that when he thinks of Russia, he's really thinking of himself, that there's a kind of at least a partial tying of Russia's destiny to the will of a single individual. So, not sure that's an adequate answer, Mike, but that's a brief comment that may have some value. Alistair Shanks, a democratic Russia that wasn't a threat to its neighbors or the rest of the world would have been in a much better place if there was a country that was hell-bent on self-destruction as Russia. Surely there would be someone close to Putin with half a brain that would put a bullet in his head if he looked like releasing nuclear Armageddon. You cannot be a rich oligarch in a world burned to a crisp. I think that has a lot of weight, Alistair, with a qualification. So what has weight is that Russia missed its democratic opportunities, and that this war is the most stunningly illogical enterprise Russia has undertaken in its history, I would argue, or at least in its recent history of a couple of centuries. And it's also true that there may be people around Putin when Putin is losing very badly who are not interested in him carrying on with further utterly self-destructive actions. But unfortunately, this point of you cannot be a rich oligarch in the world bent to a crisp is a Western myth, because there are no oligarchs in Russia. There's two things you've got to keep in mind here. First, there is no independent power in Russia that is a product of you having a lot of money. If you're an oligarch in Russia, you're not really an oligarch. You're completely subservient to the regime. You have no power at all. That's one thing. Second thing, over many, many years, Putin has tried to gather the best people around him, but the pool he was choosing from are people who are utterly corrupt and people who are utterly subservient. So that's also something we've got to be aware of when we think of individuals we might find around Putin. Annie asks, when I hear Putin talk, can't we just replace Russia with the royal we, which really means him? We can half do that, as I keep arguing, yes. In that context, him being ill or not ill, surely he realizes his mortality and wants a legacy? Sure. And is this, by which I presume his nuclear threat, his ongoing nuclear threat, a high-level play where he can scare everyone, both Russians and anybody else, so they can get their claws into Ukraine or Ukrainian resources, like Putin would love them to? Annie, I think that if I understand what you're asking, then there's a kind of an almost banal truth to us when we say this, yes. Because a banal truth to what we're saying, because obviously Putin is using his nuclear threats, his nuclear blackmail, to get outcomes. And in fact, we've argued on the main channel and on the second channel here that blackmail is the key quote-unquote diplomatic tool of the Russian Federation, nuclear blackmail, and that'll continue to be so. It's a fascinating conversation for another time to what extent that's been at all effective. But yes, I think that if that's what you're asking me to comment on, then that's absolutely right. And it's not just right, it's the main enterprise in Russian quote-unquote diplomacy. Andrew Green asks, someone who believes in mystical thinking has clearly entered the realm of unreality. I wouldn't go that far, or at least stylistically I'd be tempted to just slow down, simply because war started for mystical reasons is a human normal. We're not going to grow out of that. We're going to have war started for mystical reasons in 50 years, in 100 years, in 500 years. And so it's really important to, in that sense, in that ghastly sense, appreciate the normalcy of Putin's war. It returns European history to a certain kind of normal. Yeah? In the sense that these mystical wars ain't a thing we're going to get rid of. But of course, there are senses in which the mystical story is unreal. How do we engage in logical reasoning if Putin is operating in that kind of world? Look, here is a way of not watching that video in the main channel. Here's the claim in it, basically. Putin is very, very concerned to avoid a strategic nuclear exchange. Western leaders are very, 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 very concerned to avoid a strategic nuclear exchange. And the difference between these many varies is fascinating. And we've got to talk about it. And that's what that video is about. And what that difference means is that the preponderance of our discourse about nuclear rationality needs an adjustment, because all too often we keep asking, is Putin a rational actor, just like Biden? Or is Putin nuts and is somebody who doesn't mind World War III? And you see, we've got to break out of that dichotomy whereby we say he's rational, he's rational, he's rational, he's rational. Oh, is he crazy? No, he's rational, but maybe he's crazy. And open up a space in between these two dichotomous points and say, look, we're broadening our conception of rationality to include some of these mystical stories about how things work that Putin subscribes to. And that doesn't mean that we say we want to avoid nuclear war and he doesn't. It's rather to say that you've got to be out of your mind if you think that Putin wants to avoid World War III as much as Biden or a European leader. I genuinely think you've got to be out of your mind if you're studying this, and that's the conclusion you've come to. I'm being forceful and hyperbolic here, but that's to make this point. But this doesn't mean we jump to the idea that Putin wants World War III. It's just that he's less committed to avoiding it while being committed to avoiding it. You know, a pull in a certain direction doesn't go away just because somebody else is pulled in that direction more strongly. We are more strongly pulled to avoid this. Putin is also pulled to avoid this. But we've got to have a conversation that allows us to say that Putin is rational, but that he weighs this slightly differently to us. So I think there's one more question from John Fenlon. And John says, look, imagine an American president giving a similar interview to the one that we showed in the video on the main channel, against the backdrop of American paranoia about a preemptive nuclear strike from the Soviet Union at the heart of the Cold War. Wouldn't they say the same thing that Putin said, that a world without freedom or democracy might not be a world we want to exist, and that this is unacceptable? I think so. And I think Putin, John goes on, reacts this way when in reality he knows there is no threat. He just needs the appearance of a threat to do what he wants. I think the real risk is what he does now that he's got himself into this dreadful war and how far he is an all or nothing kind of guy. John, I think that this is... this needs a little bit of a challenge or an adjustment from one aspect. And that's the idea that Putin knows that there is no threat. We've argued repeatedly here, and I think on the main channel too, that this is a defensive war for Putin, and that Putin is delusional about the threat he perceives, or at least overwhelmingly delusional, but that he perceives that there is a threat. He believes the threat is existential to Russian civilization. He even sees it as a threat to him and his life. And that threat really is Ukraine existing as a democratic state. Forget NATO, forget the European Union. Just Ukraine existing as a relatively democratic state, Putin believes is a threat to him. And that threat will activate, especially, he thinks, when things begin to wobble in Russia. And having Ukraine, a free Ukraine on Russia's border, is a complete catastrophe. So I do think it's important to see Putin fight in a defensive war. And then a few folks in the community have asked me to comment, and I can't in detail, I think, without making a separate video about it, about this story of the Russian channel and the Russian news platform Dost potentially being thrown out of Latvia. Let me just make this kind of comment. In general, Dost is clearly an anti-war platform. It's a platform that vehemently condemns the Russian attack on Ukraine. And if you look at people like Tikhon Zitko or Kati Kodrikadze, people who are the heart of this platform, they have a visceral, physical, they want to throw up 20 times a day when they look at this war. So anybody who is arguing that that's not the case, that that's not the character of that platform, I do think needs to check themselves. But then there's this broader point that we've got to put on the table, and that's that it's a key European security interest to get all Russian anti-war voices to have a shot of being heard, to have a shot of being active, to have a shot of working meaningfully. That's as far as I'm going to go today, because otherwise I'm going to get into the intricacies of the case. Let's 11 talk soon. Oh, by the way, the video is here in case you haven't seen it, the nuclear video from the main channel. Let's 11.